is the lecture for Iris Marion Young's Social Difference as a Political Resource, Section 6. Like with the previous lecture, you can watch this either before or after doing the reading. You don't have to do it first. Either option works. So just one topic, objectivity and Sen versus Rawls. So on 113, she starts talking about objectivity and she says, modern thought has often conceptualized objectivity as achieved by transcending particularities of social position and experience, abstracting from them to construct a standpoint outside and above them that is general rather than particular. All the critics of the politics of difference whom I cited appear to assume that a normatively objective concern for justice requires such bracketing or transcending of a particular social location and adopting a view from nowhere. So that kind of objectivity, if it sounds familiar, but even if it doesn't, we've seen it before. We saw it in Rawls, basically. So for Rawls to sort of reach a view of justice that's fair and that's sort of objectively determined, you abstract away from all the particular features of yourself. You sort of go behind the veil of ignorance so that you don't know anything about yourself. And from there, you can make decisions. You're still sort of making subjective decisions. You're making them for what's best for yourself. But because you don't know anything, it sort of like turns them into objective decisions. You're sort of making decisions that are just for all of society. And so for Rawls, objectivity is a matter of like sort of getting away from particularity, or at least that that's one way of understanding what Rawls is doing. Young does not like this view of objectivity. She sort of gives two objections to it first. Second. Uh, she says, we thus need a different account of the distinction between a merely subjective or self-regarding point of view and an objective point of view. On this account, the one she wants to endorse, objectivity is an achievement of democratic communication that includes all undifferentiated social positions. So we could keep going, but basically the thought is objectivity is a matter of including a lot of different viewpoints. And if that sounds familiar, or if it doesn't sound familiar, or whatever, we've seen something like this before. We saw it in Sen. So Sen critiqued Rawls and the sort of Rawlsian way of approaching things, and he said, I prefer the sort of Adam Smith approach where we sort of have like sort of like bringing in outside viewpoints and imagining a sort of dialogue from people who are like not involved and also people who are involved, is sort of like like incorporating all these different viewpoints. And that's how we should make determinations about justice. And so Sen's position is much closer to what Young is defending here. So both Young and Sen are concerned with including additional viewpoints. So in this way, both of them are quite different from at least how we might initially think about Rawls. But it's not clear that Young and Sen agree 100%. So Young wants to include all the differentiated social positions. Sort of, what does she mean by all? Is it everybody in society or everybody in the entire world? I don't know, but it seems like it's society. I don't know. She doesn't specify this, but I think she has in mind society. And if you recall, Sen was pretty concerned about bringing in viewpoints from outside of society, even. Like he wants to bring in viewpoints from people who are sort of not in the society. And in fact, this is one of the specific critiques he had of Rawls, because in Rawls, you go behind the veil of ignorance, but you know that you're choosing principles for the society that you live in. And Sen says, no, we need even that is too parochial, even that is too limited. We need people outside views from like, foreigners effectively. Maybe they can see things about us that we can't see ourselves. So Sen might be wanting to include more viewpoints than Young. It's not clear to me. And second, Young, I think, has a more practical approach to this sort of thing. So when she's talking about an achievement of democratic communication that includes all differentiated social positions, she has in mind like actual communication, basically. So like you reach objectivity when you've sort of set up society in a way that brings these viewpoints into the discussion. So that's like a practical thing. Sen, if you go back and look, he's kind of talking about like a theoretical construct. For him, justice is determined by like what would happen if you got a bunch of outside viewpoints and sort of had a dialogue. it's less clear that you actually have to have the dialogue. Like it's not clear that, you know, India has to fly in people from Mexico and Belize and stuff in order to come to decisions. Rather, maybe Sen is doing a thought experiment like Rawls is doing a thought experiment. For Rawls, it's not like you literally have to go behind the veil of ignorance. You can't. You can't just forget stuff about you. But you might imagine what it would be like to do that. The reason to think Sen is doing a hypothetical thing is that he's modeling it on Adam Smith, and Adam Smith is sort of imagining an impartial spectator and what they would say about something. Of course, you don't actually find like an impartial spectator. You don't go and find some impartial person. Nobody like that exists. It's just a thought experiment. Whereas for Jung, this is not a thought experiment. This is how things actually ought to work. So that's a way of comparing and contrasting Jung with some of the other people that we've read so far. And I mean, this is just interesting on its own, but it's also interesting, like, if you've just this idea of objectivity and objectivity being something that should underlie our political judgments. This is something that we've seen uh, not really explicitly discussed, but it's come up implicitly in much of the stuff we've read. Almost everything we've read, it's sort of come up in some form or another. Rawls, I mean, Rawls is like at first glance, Rawls is maybe looking for an objective sort of approach to these sorts of things. Look, there's one answer behind the veil of ignorance. Everybody comes to the same answer, and so like that's the objectively right answer. For Rawls, it's a bit more complicated because if you think about how reflective equilibrium works, it's not like obviously objective, but that's a big separate topic where we won't talk about this right now. So there's Rawls, and then who did we read next? Nozick certainly was assuming there's just objective right and wrong answers. He thinks like, look, my theory of justice, like if you acquire something, if you come to own something in a just way, or if you transfer it in a just way, then it's just, and there's just objective facts about this. Sen, we've already talked about. He seems to be leaning in the direction of objectivity, but understood in a different sort of way, in the way that Jung is kind of understanding it, kind of. Estlund and Williams. Williams, we talked a little bit about this in class, but very little. It doesn't come up a lot in the lecture, but like Williams is basically rejecting very strongly the idea that like objectivity has any special role to play in political discourse. Rather, for Williams, political philosophy sort of starts with the particulars of the community that has sort of managed to get away from killing, everybody's stopped killing each other, and now we're in a political situation, and now it's time to figure out how to do things. That's not for him an objective project. It's specific to each kind of community and really to the circumstances the community finds itself in the world. So like at this point in time in the world, it's hard or impossible to be a legitimate community without being liberal. But like that's just a feature of where we are historically right now. This is not like an objective fact about like the whole of human society. So Williams is very clearly rejecting objectivity. Estlund was, I think, even without mentioning it, just assuming objectivity is sort of true. Like there is some objective right answer to questions about justice and stuff, and we want to go find that, whether or not it's plausible. What did we read after Estlund and Williams? I don't know. At some point we got to the democracy stuff. With Anderson and Arneson, Arneson, I don't know, doesn't really take a stand except he like, yeah. So the simplest thing is Arneson doesn't really take a stand. He just says whatever is better, we should do it. Better could mean objectively better. Better could mean subjectively better. I don't know. He just like, he wants you to fill in the blank. So whatever you think about objectivity, if you think there's just an objectively right answer to these sorts of things, then he says, okay, use that. And then whatever gets us objectively the best stuff, that's how much democracy to have. If you think this is all subjective, if you think it depends on each society or whatever, fine. Then just that tells you how, that subjective standard tells you how much democracy to have. Anderson, I don't know, she's sort of leaning to objectivity in the Jung kind of sense, which is that each society kind of decides for itself what the right answer is. This is sort of how democracy works. But like that sort of thing that each society should decide, that's sort of like objectively true. Like it's not like a subjective fact that we should leave it up to societies to decide. No, every society should be democratic according to Anderson. Like it would be bad if a society were not democratic and not making up its own mind about this stuff. Democracy is intrinsically good. It's intrinsically just. We must have democracy. And I think I skipped some of the readings, but like, so this is just to flag the idea of objectivity. We've seen it before, not sort of very explicit, although it came up a bit in Rawls and Sen. Now it's coming up explicitly in Young, and it's going to keep coming up either explicitly or implicitly through the rest of the course. So start maybe paying more attention to it if you want to, or don't. It's up to you, but this is, just to fill out the idea a bit.